This is the 5th week of a 5-week series, so this is the end. But we've been talking about a culture of relational discipleship. And this is something that is not just a neat idea for a time. It's not something that we're trying to kind of do as a program for the church. We want this to be the heartbeat of Midtown Church, and we think that it's the way that God would use us to really impact this city. That if we developed a culture of relational discipleship that was based on the way Jesus reached out to people, and if we allowed God to change us into His image, if we allowed God to continue to work on us from glory to glory, to transform us into the image of Jesus Christ, that God would honor that and use that in great ways, and His name would go out all over this city. So we've been talking about this, and as a wrap-up for this series, I'm going to talk about the discipleship process and kind of knock it down, and my desire is that you would see yourself in this some way. If you haven't seen all of these messages, the great thing is they're now all online. If you go to our website, midtownchurch.com, click on the Sermons tab, the first 4 in this series are on there, and this one will be up soon. But you're here for this one, so you don't need that. Question. Did you ever wish that something could happen a little bit quicker in your life? As in, like, instantly? Who remembers being 14 and watching people drive a car and going, I want that tomorrow? Who remembers starting college with all that excitement, but then somewhere maybe in your second year, you're like, I wish this thing was over? Who started a job and looked up and saw where they want to be and were like, you know what, I want to be there now. I don't want to do all this grunt work that's going to get me to that place. I mean, we all understand that maybe things take some time, but we'd like them to go like that, right? But life's a process. So many things in life are a process. And we need to understand that a little bit, because you have to go through a certain place to get to a certain place. You can't skip steps. You progress from one place to another. Now, all of us would like to, right now, here today, become super Christians like Bam. And if I could just say this like really good prayer over us, you know, and wave a magic crossed hand or something, and we'd all be super Christians, wouldn't that be awesome? Bad news, it doesn't work that way. I got to be honest with you. But being a disciple is the goal. And that thing's a process. And you have to complete one stage before you can begin another. It's very much like growing up. You have to be born first before you can be an infant, right? And once you're an infant, you cannot become a child until you get past being an infant. Once you're a child, you don't get to instantly become a teenager. You've got to go through that life stage. As a teenager, you get to become a young adult. From young adult, you become a full-fledged adult. And one day, a parent, and actually even a grandparent too. It's just like growing up is how that works. It works the same way with being a disciple. You have to go through the stage to get you to the next one. And if you don't go through the stage, if you stay stuck in a stage, it can get pretty ugly. If you take a look at people growing up, if people get stuck in that child stage and they never move beyond that to young adults, it's pretty ugly. Think of it particularly when they start maybe having kids, and now you've got a child having a child. A lot of the problems in this country result from that, I think, that people were never really grown up, never raised, never became responsible and others focused, and they just started reproducing. And then when they have a child, they don't even know how to take care of themselves. So it's a process. Growing up, being a disciple, but the end game is the same at some level. It's to be somebody who's going to reproduce. We all desire to reproduce ourselves in the life of others at some level. Whether we actually have children, or maybe we adopt children, or we work in the lives of others. That's what we want to be. But if you want to be a disciple maker, what you've got to be first is a disciple. When our girls were little, we used to, you know, when they were saying, oh, I don't have any friends, our response was always, in order to have a friend, you need to be a friend. You ever heard that? You have to reach out to somebody and show that friendship, and that's what gets people to respond. And it's somewhat similar with disciple making. If you want to be a disciple maker, you've got to be a disciple first. That's what's going to equip you to be able to make disciples. And there's 3 things that are very important to understand. And actually, I got 2 sets of 3 that I want to hit you with. In this process, as we're transformed, the first thing that's transformed is our head. We start thinking differently. And then from there it moves to our heart, and it encompasses our attitudes and our lifestyle and what we really believe. And ultimately it goes on to our hands, where we start doing things. As God works in us, He changes our mind, He'll change our hearts, and then He'll change our actions. That's the progression that happens as you grow up as a disciple. And there's three people who are going to play a part in that. There's your part, the part that you play yourself. There's others' parts, the parts of people that will disciple you and pour into your life. Or if you're on the other end of it, where you're now discipling the people whose lives you will pour into. But ultimately, there's always God's part. And we have to be content to do a best job that we can do of our part. We can't control the other people's parts, and we have to let God do His thing in the time that He's going to do it. But as we grow as disciples, as we decide that we're going to get on board with this, what we can control is our part. And that's the thing I want you to focus on today. But don't lose track of the fact that there's other things going on. And ultimately, Jesus is the one who's in charge of this. He's the one who starts it. He's the one who finishes it. He is what it's all about. It's the ongoing process that we see shown in Philippians chapter 1, verse 6. Paul talking to the Philippians, he's talking to them about the growth they've had in Jesus Christ. And he says to them, I am certain that God, who began the good work within you, will continue His work until it is finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns. That's where we keep our focus on the fact that this is God's thing He's doing in your life. If you want to be a disciple, you've got to yield to Him and let Him do His thing. But you've got to play your part. We're not passive. We don't just sit there and let it happen, right? But it's God's work that we yield to. And God's going to keep at it. That's the thing we can be encouraged about. Even though it seems at times like we're maybe getting stuck, or we're kind of going through a bad stage, or we're not growing, God's doing something with that. Trust that He's got a plan to grow you up exactly the way He wants to grow you up. I said last week that God doesn't make any mistakes in anybody He creates. He creates each of us the way we are. But the other thing He doesn't make any mistakes is in the discipleship process that He takes you through. Now you can supplant that sometimes by not yielding and going a different way, but He's got a plan that He's working through you to grow you, to make you into, ultimately, a tool in His hands to make other disciples. So I want to encourage each of us today to let God work on you and stay engaged in the process. Because we're all in different places. I mean, I can't say here's where we are today. We're all over the place, and that's okay. It's okay wherever you are. Yeah, sometimes people get a little discouraged and they'll say, well, I've been following Jesus for a lot of years and it seems like I'm still here. That's not the thing. The thing is, what are you going to do about it? Don't get caught up in the fact that you've maybe gotten stuck. Get caught up in the fact of what you're going to do to get yourself out of it, to call other people in to help you, to focus your life on God. And as the process of being grown as a disciple continues, just keep looking at yourself, keep looking at Jesus, keep engaged in the process. Because just like a human being, we need to grow up so that we can be what we're supposed to be. So we're going to look at these, it's got 5 stages that I want to take you through. And now, I didn't bring the wheel today, because I didn't want to belabor the wheel. But you guys know how I feel about the wheel, right? I mean, we're like this, me and the wheel. We've got copies that are hanging around. You can go to reallifechurch.com and engage in that. But I'm going to kind of knock down the wheel for you today. But it's important to understand that that wheel represents this process. And what I want you to do today is see yourself in this and figure out how you're going to go to the next stage, okay? First stage, stage 1, is being born again, okay? Now, what's important to understand about this is that you have to come to life in Christ before you can be a disciple. This is a stage you cannot skip. Ephesians chapter 2, 1 through 5, it details what happened when Jesus Christ brought each of us out of darkness into His kingdom. It says, once you were dead because of your disobedience and your many sins. You used to live in sin, just like the rest of the world, obeying the devil. Now, I want to take a second here. It's like, gosh, I didn't just live in sin. I didn't just always obey the devil. Yeah, we all did. Maybe it didn't look so bad, but that's where we've all come from. The commander of the powers of the unseen world, that's Satan. He's the spirit at work in the hearts of those who refuse to obey God. All of us used to live that way, following the passionate desires and inclinations of our sinful nature. By our very nature, we are subject to God's anger, just like everyone else. But God is so rich in mercy, and He loved us so much that even though we were dead because of our sins, He gave us life when He raised Christ from the dead. And it's only by God's grace that you've been saved. We all start out spiritually dead. God offers the exact same thing to each of us. He'll pull us out of sin's ownership, and He'll turn us over to His ownership. He'll bring us into His kingdom and reunite us with Him. And God made the way. But there's a part that we have to play. We have to accept this. We have to surrender to it. We have to go ahead and relinquish our life over to God in order to be reunited with Him. And we can't earn it. There's no way that we can be good enough to deserve God's grace, that we can be good enough to deserve God's forgiveness. I mean, when Anna was talking about the forgiveness of sins was bought by the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. But again, it's not just a passive thing where you're like, that's a great idea. I think that's really cool that Jesus did that. On with my life. In order to truly become a disciple, we have to surrender our life and every bit of it over to God. And what does that look like? That looks like just you saying that today. God, I give you my life. Show me how to do that. Show me how to be that way. Because if we don't start this process right, we're not going to be disciples. And I encourage you today, whether you think you may have gotten all this straightened around, you can't overdo it. You can resurrender your life to God today in a new and fresh way. You can tell Him, yes, God, however I've been as a disciple, I want to go deeper. Yes, God, I want to give you my whole life. I want to make you the Lord of it. So start right, and that sets the stages up. But stage 2 is also incredibly important for the foundation of our discipleship. Stage 2 relates to infancy, okay? And it's where you start to develop a personhood. Little Isaac is a great example. He is developing a personhood right before Sean and Marika's eyes. I mean, every day he's more of a person, isn't he? It's awesome. And he's doing it because he's going after it. As a child, we want to grow. We just instinctively know that we want to be something. And we just start living life out. This is what we need to do as disciples also. We need to engage in that process right from the get-go. The way you get started as a disciple will lay the foundation for how you do it from there on out. I mean, you can make corrections, but if you get it going right from the get-go, it's going to be a lot richer. Take a look at this passage in 1 Peter chapter 2. Peter's talking to new believers, and he's talking to them about how they need to kind of go after God. And he says, like newborn babies, you must crave pure spiritual milk so that you will grow into a full experience of salvation. You see, in order for us to really understand what Jesus has done for us, we've got to let Him show us the fullness of it. We can surrender our life on a moment and go, okay, God, I give you my life. But there's so much more to understand about it. And so we've got to continually say, God, show me what this is about. Explain to me these spiritual truths, these realities of what you've done in terms of making us from dead to life. And Peter encourages these believers, he says, cry out for this nourishment. And when a baby or an infant wants something, what does it do? Wah! Now, I'm not encouraging you all to just scream like that when you want something. But what I'm encouraging you to do is to go after what you need. Cry out for this nourishment. It says, now that you've had a taste of the Lord's kindness. You know, a baby screams for its bottle because it's tasted it and he knows it works for him or her. Once you've had a taste of the reality of who Jesus Christ is, I hope you would cry out to God, give me more, God. Show me how this whole thing works. Teach me by your word how that I might be your disciple. And we need the spiritual nutrition to grow. I mean, if you become a Christian and then you are not fed in any way, shape, or form, you're just going to continue to be a little baby crawling around. And I don't know about you, but last time I checked, a little baby crawling around doesn't do anybody any good. How can a little baby crawling around help anybody? How can a little baby crawling around be the hands and feet of Jesus Christ that we're called to be? Can a little baby crawling around do anything to impact the lostness of this city? No. We've got to go someplace else. But don't let it be passive. You've got to go after it. The beginning of your discipleship, the beginning of your growth, has a pattern that needs to be set of activity, not passivity. There's way too many Christians who get born again, they give their life to Jesus, and then they sit there like, okay, I'm just waiting for Jesus to come back. Go after that growth model. Go for it. And again, this is a very important stage. It starts the whole deal. Now, the focus of discipleship for you at that stage, if you're at that stage, you need to focus on creating new habits, new truth, and new relationships. For those who are discipling those who are at that stage, they need to share these new habits. They need to share these new truths. They need to share their life and their relationships. So there's two sides to every stage. There's the person who's in that stage, and then there's those who are trying to help that person move to the next stage. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And you don't have to be all the way through your stages to help somebody. All you got to do is be at the next stage. But you can even do it peer-to-peer. You can encourage the other person. Maybe we're both babies, you know. We can help each other. We can move each other along in the process. But we don't want to stay as infants. We need to grow up, and we need to become children. Stage number 3 is childhood, and it has to do with this growth between the ages of about, 4 and maybe 12 or whatever. We go through a huge amount of growth as people. And there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen in the life of a disciple for you to grow through this stage. 1 Thessalonians 2:10 and 12 talks about what we need at this stage. Paul, talking to these Thessalonian believers, he says to them, "You yourselves are our witnesses, and so is God, that we were devout and honest and faultless towards you as believers." Now that's the discipler point of view. That's Paul saying, this is what we did for you because you needed it. And he says, "And you know that we treated each of you as a father treats his own children. We pleaded with you, we encouraged you, and we urged you to live your lives in a way that God would consider worthy. For he called you to share in his kingdom glory." Each of us are called to be a disciple maker, a fisher of men. And so we need somebody to parent us so that we can grow up. But we need to be actively involved at that point. It's a key time for people to pour into our lives. And as children in the discipleship process, we need to allow people to pour into our lives. We need to actively seek out people who will pour into our lives. And we need to just soak it in. We need to be encouraged. We need to be urged to live the kind of life that God has called us to. And we need to move from this place of childhood self-indulgence, where everything is about us, to the place where we begin living out the life that God's called us to. And this is a real place of tension, because what happens at this age in a child is you're forced into young adulthood, and you grow up and you got to deal with it. And hopefully my daughter doesn't mind me talking about this, but she's right in the middle of it. Maddie's in the middle between being a child and an adult, and sometimes she's in a child life, and sometimes she's in adult life. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of stress trying to figure out where you are. That's what comes in the growing up. You cannot avoid it. And there's nothing wrong with it, unless you let that tension keep you where you are. Unless you're like, this is too hard to grow up, I'm just going to continue to be a child. She can't do that, really, because she's growing up. But we can do that spiritually. Sometimes as we start to make moves for God, Satan comes after us, and he'll knock us down a little bit. He'll discourage us. And we'll decide it's a lot easier and a lot safer to just be a child and sit here and think about myself. This is the major trap that we find in churches all over this country and all over the world, is people become disciples, but when things start to get a little tough through the tension of growing up as a child, they just camp out. And they stay right there in the child stage. And there's people in churches who've been Christians for 45 years who are still children. Still self-focused, still self-indulged, still I, me, mine. And it's sad. That's what I was saying, it's ugly. It really is when that shows. And I've seen some stuff like that. It's sad. We've got to move on to that next place where we become focused on God's will and doing stuff for others. We've got to move through that tension. We've got to live through it. It's just part of the deal, guys. This is the tough stage to move. Now the focus there for you, if you're in that child stage, and again, this is something that's not cut and dry. It's like one day you're not a child and the next day you're a young adult spiritually. You kind of shift back and forth through that as you're making your way through it. What ultimately you want to do is get to the point where your life is more characterized by being a young adult than being a child in the discipleship process. So what you need to focus on there is connecting to God, connecting to others, and connecting to purpose. This grows you up out of yourself. It's just like that whole thing with that shoebox thing. That guy was talking about how he was blown away by the way God's doing this massive move. Guess what, guys? You don't have to go take shoeboxes all over South America to see God doing some massive things in the lives around you. It's happening. Open up to it. Get out of yourself. See the big vision and the big purpose that God is fulfilling in our midst and join in on that. Jump on board. Yeah, it's scary. Yeah, it's inconvenient. You know, there's lots of other things we'd all like to do. You think about your favorite thing and how you'd like to be doing that right now or whatever, and that you probably choose to do that instead of being involved in the lives of others. But that's not what God's called you to, and ultimately it's not what's going to fulfill you and make you who you want to be. You can have all that fun playing those video games. I don't want to pick on the video gamers, but you're never going to grow into who God wants you to be until sometimes you put that controller down and go outside into your neighborhood, into your city, into the world, and see what God's doing. Now, as you're a discipler in that place, you've got to help people connect to God. Okay? You've got to show people how to get deeper into God's Word. You have to take people to the point where they see others before they see themselves. You've got to bring them along in what you're doing. As a discipler, the biggest thing that Jesus did is He brought His boys along with Him wherever He went, right? Think about it. What Jesus did, He's out healing. Come on, boys, check this out. Come along with me. I'm preaching to people. The boys are here. They're watching. This is what we have to do as disciple makers, is we got to invite people to come along in what we're doing and help them connect to God, connect to others, and connect to purpose. And again, let's not let each other get stuck in this place of being spiritual children. And again, you don't have to be any further along than anybody else to maybe say, you know what, let's do something like this together. Hey, let's make a shoebox together. Hey, let's get involved in the food drive. Hey, let's look around and see what our neighborhood needs. And let God move us into the stage of young adult, because that's where all the good stuff starts happening, guys. And if you remember being a teenager or a kid, what did you want more than anything else? You wanted to grow up and get into the real world, right? You wanted to get out there and get a job, or get a place, or get married, or whatever it was. That's where the real stuff happens. That's where we fulfill our adulthood. Stage 4, being a young adult, is where we find ourselves growing into maturity. And again, as followers of Jesus, this is where all the rubber hits the road, where we start really realizing what God's got for us. And it's a beautiful, rich place, guys. I want to encourage you. The things that will happen when you give your life away, you cannot experience those any other way than by giving your life away. You will not find the richness and the fulfillment and the purpose that you will find in serving others and doing ministry in your own deal. If you want to stay in your own little deal and keep your own little machine and keep your own little life, I'm telling you, you're not going to find what you can find elsewhere. But you've got to get out of yourself. Paul sharing with the Philippians in chapter 2 again here. This is a part of a very famous passage. It's just a little bit of it, verses 3 and 5. He says, don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Here's the other thing too. When you're a child, you're all focused on me and what people think about me. As you become a young adult, you start doing your own thing, and it's whatever you do is good enough, because you don't have to worry about everybody, what they think. Just be yourself. This is what we have to be in Christ. We've got to get our eyes off ourselves and start thinking about others. Don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than ourselves. Don't look only for your own interest. Don't look out only for your own interest. But take the interests in others. You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Our pattern, who we're supposed to be, is Jesus. It's all about others. All throughout the Gospels, everything He did was for others. And ultimately, the act of the sacrifice on the cross was for each and every one of us to be reunited with our Creator. And it's others focused. You've got to get your eyes off yourself, though. You've got to quit comparing yourself to other people. And again, like I said, wherever you are in this process, just deal with that. Don't be like going, you know what? I'm here and somebody else is here. You're not going to grow like that. You're going to grow by keeping your eyes on Christ and saying, wherever I am, God, take me someplace else. And humility is what makes it happen. And humility is extremely hard to cultivate in this world that we live in. Because this world that we live in, no matter who you are, is telling you exactly the opposite of that all day, every day, 24/7. You matter. You're important. You're somebody better than anybody else. It's all about you. You're bombarded with those messages. In order to be humble, you've got to ask God to make you humble. Now, here's the scary part, ladies and gentlemen. If you're going to pray the prayer of asking God to make you humble, be prepared, because the way He does it is He humiliates you. I'm not kidding you. And it sounds kind of trite as I say it right here today, but that's the thing. If you earnestly pray for God to make you humble, He will humiliate you, and it will not be fun, but it'll be good. And it'll be worth it, and it'll take you places that you can't go until you have been humbled. I got to hear a guy by the name of Richard Blackaby speak a couple weeks ago, and his father is a very famous pastor by the name of Henry Blackaby, and he wrote an earth-shattering study called Experiencing God, which is a little plug for the future. We're going to be walking through some messages that come from experiencing God. But Richard Blackaby, about his father, said, "My dad didn't have anything special." This study has been done by millions and millions of people, and I just met a guy this last week who said how it's transforming his church. He says, "My dad didn't have anything special, but my dad is the humblest man before God that I've ever met." And that's what released the power of God in him to create that study that is changing the lives and has changed the lives of millions of people. You cannot replace humility in the life of discipleship. That's what designates a true, mature young adult, is they're understanding humility, they're embracing it, and they're living it out in reality. It's hard. It's not easy to be humble, especially when you look like this. Not. The discipleship focus in that young adult stage is doing. It's getting out there and doing. Like I said earlier, it starts in your head, it moves to your heart, then it becomes the work of your hands. What young adults do is they do ministry. They actively participate in the will of God in people's lives. You know, they don't theoretically talk about how neat it would be to serve God. They don't have these great ideas for some ministry that they're going to do in the future. They do. And that's what you need to do in order to grow. You need to just get in stuff. It may not be the perfect fit for you. It may not be what you really dig doing. That's not the point. The point is that you go ahead and say, I'm going to do. I'm going to be available. I'm going to say, God, go ahead and use me in this place, and I'm going to figure out what He wants to do. Now, if you're trying to make disciples and you're helping somebody move through this place, what you need to do is pull them into places of ministry, give them opportunities, empower them, and turn them loose. And as well as I can, that's pretty much what I try to do with everybody around here. I'm like, okay, you good at that? Let's go. Here you go. It's yours. Go do it. That's how somebody learns how to do. We can't all sit around and watch somebody. And one of the problems in the American Christian church is we're often a body of spectators, and there's a couple of people who are doing ministry. And there's this attitude, well, that's the pastor's job to win souls. That's the pastor's job to disciple. That's the pastor's job to help people. Not around here. It's all of our jobs. And if I have things my way, I want to work myself right out of a job. I'll just take off. You guys just run this thing. No, I miss you guys too much. But that's where we need to focus to become a young adult. And then from there, the last stage, parenthood. This is where we reproduce, okay? Now, the difference between being a young adult and parenthood is not a lot. You're still doing all those things. The difference is that now you're strategically thinking about how you're going to bring somebody up to where you are. You don't stop doing ministry. You don't stop being connected to God. You don't stop traveling deep with God. But what you do is you say, come along with me, and I'm going to show you how to do it, and I'm going to let you do it. I mean, you show somebody, and then you turn them loose. Take a look at 2 Timothy chapter 2, 1 and 2. Paul's saying to Timothy, who's his spiritual son, who's his disciple, and Timothy at this stage is probably a young adult, okay? Timothy's doing stuff. He's out there. He's sending him off to Crete and things like that. Paul, talking to him, helping him to finalize that process, says, Timothy, my dear son, be strong through the grace that God gives you in Jesus Christ. Don't forget that component. As we disciple people, as you reproduce, what you've got to reproduce is Christ in you. You don't just reproduce you. Nobody needs what Todd's got to offer. But people need what I can offer them in Jesus Christ. Paul wasn't saying, you need to just do what Paul does. He says to Timothy, he says, no, be strong in the grace that God gives you. Because you've heard me teach things that have been confirmed by many reliable witnesses. Now teach these truths to other trustworthy people who will be able to pass them on to others. Paul says, you've watched me do this disciple-making thing, okay? Now it's time for you to do it. You've got all the skills, you've got all the know-how, you've got the grace of God in you. It's time for you now to reproduce. And as a parent, there is nothing more gratifying than watching your children reproduce at the appropriate time. I mean, I'm looking forward to it. I'm not in any hurry for it. But I'm looking forward to it as a parent. But the other thing that is amazing to watch is that people that I've been able to pour my life into, watch them to begin to start reproducing themselves and start making disciples. There is very little that is more gratifying in this world. You got to take on that role of a parent, though. It doesn't happen by chance. And I'm learning a lot about that in just regular parenting right now, too, that there's so many things that we have to do. It's a lot of responsibility, but it's worth it. Probably one of the greatest things that we can do in this world is leave the legacy of the children that we raise. Not just the children we birth, but the children we raise. It's the same thing in the game of discipleship. What an incredible legacy that we can leave is to see somebody grow up as a disciple and become a disciple maker. And again, don't miss that that's the vision for everybody. It's not just for super Christians. It's not just for special Christians. We're all called to be disciple makers. We've all got to go there. And we don't have to. Obviously, we can say no. But if you really want to fulfill what God's called you to, if you really want to honor the sacrifice that Jesus Christ made on the cross for you, you take on that identity. And you point people to God's power. You lay down the example. Like I said, Jesus taking his boys with him everywhere he went. That's what you do. You live it out. You don't just talk it. I mean, talk is cheap, right? Now, the discipleship function here is reproduction, or the focus, excuse me. What people need to do in this stage is they actually need to reproduce. To be a disciple maker, what you've got to do is start making disciples. You can't just theoretically inhabit that role and say, I'm a disciple maker now. You actually have to build into people, pour into people, lead people along, and grow them up. As a young adult, you need somebody to turn you loose so that you can reproduce. As that parent, you need to actually show that person how it happens. Model it, do it, encourage it, and empower it. So those are the stages of growth as they relate to the stages of growth in the life of a person. You got infant, you got child, you've got young adult, you've got parent. And of course, before that, you're not even alive. But I want you to understand that process. I want you to see yourself in that process. And today, what I'd really like each and every one of you to do is realistically self-evaluate and say, where am I in this process? And again, sometimes you're fluctuating between two. But the key thing is are you an infant to the point where you really can't do anything for anybody? Are you at a place where you're a child, where you can do things for people, but you usually choose not to? Where you choose to honor yourself and indulge yourself? And just be real about it. There's nothing wrong with it. You've got to go through that to get somewhere else. But once you are a child, figure out what's going to get you to being a young adult. And as you become a young adult and you grow in that, don't stop there. That's the other place that we often leave people. We empower somebody into ministry, we get them doing ministry, and they just do ministry. They never reproduce themselves. They never create their own replacement. I had a mentor of mine said, my job as a pastor, he said, my job as a senior pastor is to work myself out of every job I have in this church. And I believe that's true. And we should see that as every individual, whatever you're doing, no matter how good you are at it, okay? You should be looking to the fact that you want to reproduce yourself and bring somebody else up to do that job so that you can move on and do other things, or you can just do it side by side. Understand the process. Be honest with yourself where you are. And then do something about it. Engage somebody's help. Take a look at some resources. Talk to somebody who's been there and has gone beyond where you are. Don't just sit there and go, well, I'm a child, that's all I can be. No. God did not start this work to leave where it is. Remember that first verse I shared? God started this work in you so that He can bring it to completion. You've got a role to play. It's not a role of passivity. It's a role of activity. Going for it, crying out for it, growing, all the time. One of the things that you can really do to make this process kind of accelerate is think about the idea of having 3 different people in your life. Okay? Each of us need a Paul, each of us need a Barnabas, and each of us need a Timothy. Now these examples come from the Bible, but each of us needing a Paul is that person who is the disciple maker. He's the guy who's been there, done it all, who's going to help you get where you need to get. We all need a mentor. And one of the things that I've found is they don't come easily. I've struggled for years and years in my Christian walk to get men to mentor me. They don't just fall off trees. But if you dedicate yourself to it and you go after it, you find the right guys, you can find a mentor. You need a Paul. The other thing you need is a Barnabas. Now Barnabas and Paul hung out together and they encouraged each other. Barnabas was the encourager, but they were kind of peers. We need to run with the runners. I got a buddy in Tennessee, he says you got to go with the goers. Find somebody else who wants to be a disciple, who's at the same place you are maybe, and do it together. Encourage each other, strengthen each other, sharpen each other, hold each other accountable. That's what a Barnabas does for you. And then each of us needs a Timothy. Each of us needs a spiritual child. We need to develop that role of becoming a disciple maker. And again, you don't have to be all the way through the process to begin it. You can pour into people's lives wherever you are and wherever they are. And if you have a Paul, a Barnabas, and a Timothy in your life, you will move through this process. It'll happen. You will not get stuck someplace. You'll go somewhere. Focusing on God's work in your life and these other people, you can get where you need to go. And that's a vision I want us all to understand. And again, don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying this is what you've got to do in order to be a good Christian. You don't. You can just sit on the sidelines. But is that what you want? None of us want that, do we? We need to figure it out. Maybe we're a little scared. Maybe we're a little hesitant. Maybe we're a little unsure. But I doubt any of us are sitting here going, nope, not me. We can all go there. We can all go there together. So I want you to just get that understood, that you can go all the way to the top. You can be a fisher of men. You can be a maker of disciples in your own way with the people that God gives you. And it's going to be the thing that impacts this city and changes this world around us. And it's going to make Midtown Church a beacon of God's love and grace and mercy to this neighborhood and this city.